Thanks. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today to discuss about the results of the research we've conducted for the past 2-3 years. So, of course, I did not did that research alone. I have the chance to work with many meaningful and very nice colleagues. So here they are. So just to give you a little background about what is child maltreatment. When I'm talking about child maltreatment, I'm talking about child abuse and neglect, or like physical abuse, psychological or physical neglect, sexual abuse, exposure to intimate violence. For example, you're a child and your parents are having physical, psychological violence, and you see that, it's a kind of child maltreatment. And also psychological abuse, so being rejected by your parents, or your parents saying not nice things to you and being very harsh on you. That's kind of psychological abuse. And usually what the research tells us about that is that children usually experience more than one form of child maltreatment. And in fact, many studies conducted around the world, it says that up to 40% are victims of abuse before the age of 18. And in fact, it's maybe a little bit more, and if you take into consideration all the forms of child maltreatment. So, and it's not only that it is very frequent, and some people are talking about a silent epidemic because we don't talk of child maltreatment that much. Often it's hidden. Children, they don't necessarily talk about it, that they are victims of child maltreatment, but it's there. When we ask children and adolescents if they have experiences, forms of abuse, unfortunately, the frequencies, the prevalence is quite high. And there are many consequences to that. And so many psychological difficulties, such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also an increased use of health and social services. They consult more, and of course, because they sometimes need help to recover. And sometimes some kids will go into addictions and other issues. And it's not only during the adolescence or during the childhood, but it continues until adulthood. So the consequences can be long-term as well. And some kids will experience severe maltreatment, and some kids will experience less severe, but not because it's not severe that it doesn't have an impact on the child. And of course, it's not because you have endured child maltreatment that you will have many consequences, because some children, some adolescents are resilient. So when I'm talking about resilience, I'm talking about how a child or an adolescent can navigate his way or her way to the psychological, social, cultural, and physical resources, so they can use those resources to sustain their well-being. And how? So the thing is, of course, the best thing would be to have no child maltreatment at all. But when they are, what can we do to foster or to promote resilience in victims of child maltreatment? So then, so for the past 15 years, I've been studying child maltreatment. And in the past years, I thought about sport participation that might help resilience. Why sport? Because we know that sport practice is related to positive youth development. So this is why we promote physical activity, but also the practice of sport, because it increases interpersonal skills. It helps build them their self-management skills, their life skills. So we can say that it's a protective factors against risky behaviors such as drug use, aggression, violence, risky sexual behaviors. So we might think that it could be a resilience factor for child maltreatment victims. But of course, sport participation is not enough to guarantee that an adolescent will experience positive development. And as you know, what we hear in the news right now is that sometimes there's sport violence in the sport context. So we need to make sure, if we want to study sport as a resilience factor, we need to make sure that sport participation is free of violence. So this brings me to the aim of our studies. We wanted to investigate the role of sport participation in the association between child maltreatment and psychological adaptation. So we had in wave one, so on the first time of data collection, we had 1,802 participants, and they were aged 14 years old. because they were in grade 9 and 10. And then we followed them a year later when they were 15 years old. So in grade 10 or grade 11. And 55% were boys, 42 were girls, and we had 1.5% of our adolescents who reported being non-binary. So we had many measures to assess child maltreatment, sport participation, violence in sport, and many outcomes of psychological adaptations, such as self-esteem, life satisfaction, body satisfaction, internalized and externalized symptoms. So when I'm talking about internalized symptoms, I'm talking about the child who's being anxious, depressed, or those kind of symptoms. So it's like internalized. And when I'm talking about externalized, it's problems that are more outside, so such as having some behavior problems, for example. And when I'm talking about sport participation, it's not only to do sport like I go running alone in the wood. It's more like being in a team, or being in a sport club, a sport federation, or to participate in some competition, in some tournaments, because we wanted to see like the environment of sport when there is like those kind of participation with a team and all of that, all the positive things that it can bring, how this could help child maltreatment victims. So we went into many schools in Quebec, and we had some questionnaires that were completed in class on electronic tablets. And at the end of the study, so the questionnaires took maybe 30 to 45 minutes to complete. And we had some draws, and we gave them some promotional material at the end of the study. So now, if we're going to talk about the result, so we measured psychological violence, physical violence, sexual abuse, exposure to intimate violence, neglect. So when we take into consideration all those forms of child maltreatment, we had quite high prevalence rates. Among girls, it was 62%, among boys, 50%, and among non-binary adolescents, it was quite high with 80%. And of course, if we look into different forms, the rates vary depending. Like sexual abuse, it's the form which is the lowest one, and psychological abuse is the more frequent prevalence of child maltreatment. And in our sample, we had like half of half of the adolescents, who like 54%, who were participating in a sport. In an organized sport, sorry. And among those kids, more than half of them answered that they experienced some sport violence, unfortunately. And if we're looking at child maltreatment, if those victims participate in sport and compared to non-victims, and what we can see is that the non-victims of child maltreatment, so those who are not victims, they participate a bit more in organized sport. And now what we did with wave 1, we did some analysis, and what we saw is that child maltreatment was associated with better psychological adaptation, so better self-esteem, better body satisfaction, life satisfaction, and less internalized and externalized symptoms. And sport participation was associated with better adaptation. And for those who were maltreated, what we saw is that those who were maltreated and participate in sport, they were having higher levels of self-esteem to those who are victims of child maltreatment but do not participate in sport, and better body satisfaction and better life satisfaction as well. And now in wave 2, so a year later, we did the same analysis, and we saw that sport participation was as well a moderator, but only for body satisfaction. But what we saw is that we had a questionnaire about the COVID-19 related distress, and those who were having higher scores of distress related to the COVID, they had a worse adaptation. So now, of course, we had an attrition rate between wave 1 and wave 2 in our study, and it was not possible to measure ongoing child maltreatment during the pandemic. So overall, we can say that sport participation is associated with better psychological adaptation, whereas child maltreatment is also associated with poorer psychological adaptation. And sport participation may be a buffer for some of the consequences of child maltreatment. But we had a high level of sport violence, and I was very concerned about that. So there is an urgent need to promote a safe and secure sport environment. And like with the COVID, we saw that it has an impact as well. So how can we make sure that adolescents have access to sport participation at all times? So to not stop the sport participation during COVID, for example, because we knew at the beginning the sport was stopped and it had some consequences. So considering that victims of child maltreatment are less likely to participate in sport, it's important to consider how to promote sport participation among adolescents to foster resilience and well-being among child victims, but also more broadly in schools. And of course, to make sure that there is no violence against athletes in sport. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you so much for that. That was such an exciting presentation. I know I've been looking forward to it myself. So my name is Beth Hudson. For everyone here today, I'm so excited to be or have the opportunity and be invited really to come moderate this. I know it's been a long time since there's been a lot more conferences. There's some more in-person ones coming up as well. And the virtual one for me is wonderful to kind of set the stage for where I'm starting off now in my world. So my name is Beth Hudson. I'm currently living in Denendeh, the North, so also known as the Northwest Territories. I'm living in Lillooet Clay First Nation in the north, and I've been living up here within the Decho region and in and out of Yellowknife for about 10 years now. And I do a ton of work kind of from the national level down to the grassroots level, really engaging with sport on the ground. And I know that I focus a lot of my work on working with kind of Indigenous communities, but also supporting sport participation, wellness, and looking really at enhancing, community wellness, and exactly really looking at how can we utilize, sport and these other, tools that exist to help build resiliency and help to build these opportunity, especially for a lot of our vulnerable populations, really across Canada and across the world. And so it's so wonderful again to see more of this research coming out from what I see as a collaborative lens. I find that we're at a point in time now where we're starting to see, individuals and communities as more than just, I guess, starting to get into research like this, that's really starting to connect dots that are so important and vital for us to understand, which is, when we're looking at, creating, sport programs or policies or legislation or opportunity, are we being inclusive? Are we able to, provide these life-saving opportunities that are so vital for so many? And I know that from an Indigenous lens, of course, sport especially has been a key topic for resiliency and overcoming a lot of what has happened, and a lot of, the stories of strength, of overcoming a lot of, social barriers, psychological barriers. A lot of what you've spoken about today is so important for all of us as providers, as programmers, as people in the field to always be aware of, to know about how sport can both be exclusionary for so many reasons, but can also, again, just be an opportunity for not only saving lives, but providing that opportunity to thrive. And so it's so wonderful to see. I know that there's definitely a lot of questions, which is so wonderful. And so let's just get right into those right away. So I know that this can be a pretty hard topic to talk about. It's challenging because we know that youth, especially depending on various factors going on in their lives, can really experience a lot. They can be going through a lot. There's a lot of factors really across Canada that can impact the quality of life or the socioeconomic status that our youth are currently experiencing on the ground. And so how do we navigate harm prevention strategies to support these youth through some of our programs? What are some ways we can start to look at harm prevention through some of our programs, or how can this research help us to help in influencing our programs, our outreach, and our communication?
I was thinking that some of the child maltreatment victims, they are sometimes placed in some re-education centers. So I was thinking that in those centers, sometimes they do stuff, some activities and all of that, but I was thinking maybe we should bring some programs for those kids who are living in those places, because we know that those adolescents, there are some research about that sometimes they are not having a positive they're not experiencing well-being in those re-education center, and I think people are doing great job to help those adolescents, but I think if we can bring more stuff for them, it could help them, of course. So because they are those youth who are placed in those places, they have experienced child maltreatment. So I think that if we go and reach them there, I think it would be very helpful for them. Yes, I was thinking, and maybe probably that we should promote like sports into schools, of course, because all kids are going to school. Well, there are some sport there, but I think we should have more, and particularly during adolescence, when we know that girls, for example, they participate less in sport, like when they are growing up, they are being older. So maybe we can help everyone to get access to sport.
Absolutely. That's so vital. Again, I know that through my lens and the work that I do, I know that really there actually hasn't been a ton of really informed research that's been done with a lot of populations, especially, again, those vulnerable populations, those populations that we might not have a ton of really meaningful, great data kind of gathered through really meaningful research such as this. And so I'm just wondering, in regards to this specific research study, I know that, of course, we're always kind of limited by our scope and what we're looking at. So for your research, in terms of things like other intersectional factors, what other data might you choose to look at moving into the future, or how would you might expand the demographics that you were looking at? So in terms of things like gender, race, income, location.
Yeah, but I think I want to look at that more closely. We just have started to do the analysis. And when you just mentioned that you were in the North Territory with the Indigenous people, so I was thinking maybe I should go there to do some interviews with those adolescents. I think it would be very interesting because we know that some indigenous populations, they have experienced more like traumas with all the things that's going on with the school, residential schools, for example, the parents who went there and all the impacts that it still continues to be there today. So I think that would be very nice to look at those adolescents. And I think there were a question about denial of gender identity. I think I'm not sure if it's the right word to talk about this, because we ask children if they self-identify as boys or girls, and for some kids they just do not identify as a girl or as a boy, and that's okay. We need to take into consideration. But what we do see is that those children are more victimized. So why are they more victimized, and how can we help them? How can we sustain their resilience? So I would really like to look more into that, and about sexual orientation, and about race and ethnicity. I think just to make sure that all people can have access to sport.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Thank you. I know I'm again just so excited to see more of this sort of research. I'm really being not only engaged but introduced within the sport world of things. I know that. So a little bit of my story was that I had gone up to about my master's level with the University of Alberta. I'm really focusing, my lens and research on supporting Indigenous communities and supporting really, Indigenous athletes too, kind of through our sports system, and understanding, the importance of these, socio factors and historical factors too. And, what does that mean for vulnerable populations? And there really is a fairly limited amount of research out there that can really help us to understand how to better support a lot of these vulnerable populations within a sport context. So it's so critical and important, I know, for the work that I do now that I'm getting back into my PhD. The reason I'm officially back in is because of researchers like yourselves that are starting again to break down these barriers, where we're starting to explore some of these other areas that I think are so important, not only for Indigenous folks as well, but for really all Canadians, because there's so many that come from, again, diverse backgrounds, that come from all over the world. And, all of us hold intergenerational trauma in different ways. We all have our own histories, whether you want to look back a short or a long ways. And again, sport can be used as a tool for good. It can be used as a way to help build those resiliency skills, to help overcome like the biggest barriers that individuals can face. But it's so wonderful again to see some more of this information coming out that can hopefully again be used by folks like myself and others on the ground, really to help inform our practice. It's so important knowing that a lot of the youth that you kind of summarize within your study are a reflection of a lot of the youth that, you know, I work with on the ground. And the positives that spin out of that really are, again, the resiliency, the stories of overcoming some of these barriers, really focusing on some more of those positives where, you know, look where, you know, some of these youth go, you know, just from having that support, those caring leaders, folks like, you know, yourselves who are really digging deep to try and find ways to best support them. So again, it's wonderful. And we'll wrap up with one last question here. So I'll kind of take a couple look at the ones that are here. So I guess just to kind of wrap up, focusing a little bit more on sport, but in terms of the context of the study, how did you kind of define sport violence or these sort of like negative or how did you define that?
Maybe some of you are aware of all the good work that Sylvie Parent is doing on sport violence. So she developed a questionnaires to measure like different kind of violence from the coaches, but from also the peers, athlete peers. So, and we have many questions about different different forms of psychological, sexual, and physical violence. So we asked those adolescents if they have experienced all of these forms of violence. So if you want to learn more, I would really encourage you to look at the Sylvie Parent's work on that, so you could see but it's very frequent, and I think that we need why there's more. Well, there's many reasons, and I think it would be another talk about that. But I think sometimes the coaches or maybe the peers, they are not maybe well trained about those forms of violence, about emotional abuse in particularly. So I think if we can do some more prevention, we will have less. Yes.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much. I found like all this information again so important, not only for, you know, my own lens, my own practice, but for so many of us that are doing this work, and to have more information about how to best support our vulnerable populations is so important. So thank you so much.